Hello, and thank you for coming this morning. Our presentation is titled Educating Globally Competent Citizens. My name is William Payne. I'm a professor of theater at the University of Minnesota Duluth. I'm also currently the interim dean of the School of Fine Arts and a global engagement scholar. We'll explain that title later. And Denny, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Denny Falk. And I don't have my mic turned on.
Yeah, you do.
So I do?
Yeah.
Okay, well, good. I'll have to be quiet when you're talking then. I'm a faculty member in the school Department of Social Work in the College of Education and Human Service Professions at UMD, and I've been happy to work with Bill on the project here for the last few years. And I'll talk with you a little later.
Okay. Today we're going to give you a little bit of background on this project. We're going to talk about courses that Denny and I and some of our other colleagues have developed at UMD, and then a toolkit that the Global Scholars created. We've delivered several workshops, and we're going to discuss those. Denny and I have also been a part of developing some global classes, and we'll talk about those, and then we'll conclude. And hopefully we'll have time for questions if we go fast enough. I want to talk about the Seven Revolutions initiative because there were unique partnerships that were created with the idea of generating courses that achieve the goal of educating globally competent citizens. Well, the first partners, the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, ASCU, which UMD is a part of, the New York Times, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and this project all began in September of 2006. Let's first introduce the partners. ASCU, there are about 430 members. I think the number of four-year students that it represents, it's a pretty large section of those students going to school. In 2003, ASCU created the American Democracy Project in partnership with the New York Times. And the goal was to educate citizens. What could higher education do to educate citizens? From that, an initiative was formed to educate globally competent citizens, and there were 8 member institutions originally who were involved, a number of about 10 or 12 scholars, faculty members from a diverse collection of disciplines across the country. And let's talk a little bit about each partner. The New York Times, obviously, maybe you've heard of it. It's a worldwide news gathering organization. One of the key things about the Times is that they have been generating a wide variety of audio and video resources. They've gone to the Times 2.0, the online version. They also were a part of the generation and eventually the ownership of something called Epsilon, a global learning management system, and they have an education wing. They've been a great partner with ASCU with regards to the American Democracy Project, and they definitely got involved with this project as well. CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a bipartisan think tank. We changed that from nonpartisan because they really are bipartisan. Just kind of depends who's in office. Who's ever in office, all the other people go work at CSIS. When it switches, they switch. But their audience is legislators, policymakers, the military, and CEOs. But they generate. They have over 200 analysts. They started the Global Strategy Institute, which synthesizes this information on the key global trends for their stakeholders. And Eric Peterson, who is no longer there, and he was the former head of GSI, he developed this framework, the 7 revolutions, 7 global trends, and which is what we used to frame some of our curriculum. The 7 revolutions are population. It's this idea that now we're at 7 billion. When I was born, there were 3 billion. And in 20, 30 years, maybe there'll be 9.5 billion. Resource management. How do we manage energy, food, water? The idea of technology. Obviously, technology has changed, perhaps not, I won't say everything, but almost everything about the way we live and the way we define who we are and the way we interact as a planet. Information flow. There's so much information and we can pluck it out of the air. Most of us who have wonderful technological tools. Who gets the information? How do we know it's good? Who generates it? How do we process all of this information? And that's changing the landscape of the world. Economic integration or globalization, this idea that the global economy is here, and we've felt the strings attached to all of us over the last years, decade or longer. I went to Europe last week, and I got very few euros for my dollar, and then they settled the Greek debt. I came back, and I got very few dollars for my euros. Okay? Conflict, the nature of war is changing, and things like drones, technology has changed the way we fight, non-state actors, terrorism. There's all kinds of changes that are in conflict. And then, of course, given all of this global change, how do we govern? And just in the last year, we've seen amazing change in several places around the world in terms of how do we govern ourselves. And so these are the 7 revolutions.
Okay, Bill's talked a bit about the structure of our project. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process, and I'm going to start with the goal. And the goal that we identified very early on was to educate globally competent citizens. And then we tried to define that and said that a globally competent citizen is a person who possesses the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to be an engaged, responsible, and effective member of a globally interdependent society. And then what we did is to say, well, we then need to think about what is the knowledge? What are the sets of knowledge attributes that people need to have in order to be globally competent? And you'll see in front of you a list of 8 characteristics. And I'm not going to spend very much time on those, but the PowerPoint will be available online. Then there's a set of skills as well. And the way these were developed is I went and talked to 22 acknowledged experts around the country and said to them, what's the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that you would want to see in a globally competent graduate of your institution? And these are the skills they identified. Also talked about attitudes of a globally competent graduate. And here you see some of those listed before you. Again, I'm not going to go through and read them, but you can take a quick look now and look more thoroughly later if you would like. So then another thing we had to do is to look at the nature of the educational setting. And what we wound up doing is focusing on ASCU institutions, those 430 public institutions, 4-year institutions around the country. And we looked at the possible settings, which would be introductory courses, capstone courses. We could infuse across the curriculum, and there were a number of other uses as well. We wanted to as well look at the learner characteristics of the typical student that might be taking this course, and what do they enter the course with? So we wanted to think about what do they currently know? What are their current skill levels? What are their attitudes? And what are their mindsets? If you're familiar with the Deloitte Mindset Inventory, you find that students entering college in the fall of 2011 might be very different than those who entered 10 years previously. So a summary of our project foundation would indicate that the goal is to educate globally competent citizens. The objectives were to develop identified knowledge, skills, and attitudes. The setting was introductory and capstone courses and possible infusion across courses, the curriculum on ASCU institutions. And learners, we would assume, would be across the perspective as they started, but often they had limited knowledge and skills, and also a fairly narrow worldview. So that's where we started. Then we wound up going to our member campuses and wound up developing courses on our own campuses. That included then the campuses that you see across here. So what we would do is we'd come together and say, well, what are the best resources that we could use to educate globally competent citizens? What are some teaching materials that we might incorporate? What are some of the content? What are some of the videos, the audio, and so forth that might be useful? And then we'd go back to our own campuses and try to develop courses. Well, we came back to UMD, and that's where we develop courses. So I've taught a course for a number of years on global issues. I'll tell you some more specifics about that in just a minute. Strategic leadership. One of our colleagues in the School of Business and Economics teaches a course on business
and strategic leadership. And what she did is to have an overview of the 7 revolutions in the first 2 weeks of the course. And then she said, okay, you are now going to be providing leadership in the context of these 7 global forces. So every time you think about some leadership issue, you ought to reflect back on that and think about, well, what is the context going to be? Have a colleague who taught a course on gender and society, looking at the changes that have happened that have affected gender roles, and then said, let's take a look into the future and think about all these forces that are going to have an impact into the future. Marriages and families worldwide. One of the things that my colleague in psychology did in teaching this class was to, again, integrate those forces that are affecting people worldwide and then say, what impact is that going to have on marriage, on families across the globe? Bill will talk a minute about an introduction to theater arts and also stage direction courses that he's taught. I'm going to focus first of all then on global issues. And this is a course that's been taught at UMD for over 30 years. But beginning in the spring of 2007, I started to integrate the 7 revolutions content as a framework. I started to integrate materials that my colleagues have developed across the country, integrate different resources, and wound up having a very different course and one that I like teaching yet more than I did previously. Previously, I used 2 books, so I'd have 2 books that I'd ask students to purchase. Now I don't use any. What I do is to have an online resource, which we'll demonstrate to you shortly, that is an online set of activities that enables students to learn a great deal about 7 revolutions. This course has been offered, first of all, in a traditional setting, also in a hybrid format where we have fewer class meetings and more online activities, and additionally in a completely online format. So we've been able to do all those different kinds of things. What I will tell you is that if you would like to take a look at the course, and it's a sample course, you can contact me. You can link towards it and see the Epsilon learning environment, the integrated learning environment that the New York Times developed. But if you want to write to me, I can grant you access to it because that's required, and the PowerPoint will enable you to do that. Then we'll move on, and Bill knows a lot more about this next course, so I'll ask him to talk about that.
So I heard about the 7 revolutions and decided that my approach to my liberal education introduction to theater arts class had been more about critical thinking and how art reflects the world that people live in. And so I said, well, I'm going to make a go at this. And I'm going to try and integrate as many of the revolutions as I can, connect them to dramatic literature. It's a large lecture liberal education course, 75 to 100 students. And linking the global trends to dramatic texts would seem to be somewhat difficult, but after thinking about it, there's a play for everything, okay? So one of the examples is that for the subject of governance, I use the play Antigone. In the play Antigone, the chorus has an opportunity to participate in the decision-making of their community by counseling Creon not to banish Antigone and sentence her to death. They don't. They abrogate their ability to affect the outcome of governance in their community. I connect this in an exercise right around the time of the Minnesota caucus, and I teach students how to caucus. And then they have an assignment where they have to go to a caucus and observe it as theater. And they have to write it up, talk about the setting, the characters, the plot, the costumes. And if for some reason they come to me and say, hey, I can't do that, I got to work, I'll say, okay, watch 90 minutes of Super Tuesday coverage and do the same thing. Analyze the sets, analyze the storylines, analyze the characters. But you know, in a sneaky way, I teach them how to caucus because it's not intuitive. I moved here from another state. We don't caucus in Ohio or Illinois, and all of a sudden you have to learn that this is participatory. I have to go and I can write a resolution and affect whatever party I align with. So there are all kinds of active learning strategies that are connected in the class. And I also moved away from a book. I used to have a big introduction to theater text, and I went with more of my content online because the New York Times repository, which is everything they've published since 1851, everything they've published, you can access it. You can create templates of content inside of the Epsilon management system. And all I would have to require, a lot of plays are going online too, especially classic plays like Antigone, you can find it online. Shakespeare you can find online, etc. So they have to buy, instead of buying a $60 book, they buy 3 play scripts that cost about $20. After developing, I also integrated this into other courses in the major, but I want to move on to 7 Revolutions activity. We all generated these classes at our various campuses, and then we came back together and said, we need to share this. So we wanted to develop a toolkit. We wanted to show how we use how someone could use the 7 Revolutions framework and integrate New York Times content to identify other online content that we had found and shared, which is one of the best parts about this collaborative process, is that I have 10 or 12 or 15 now colleagues around the country who help me learn about the subject matter. I'm a theater artist. I know theater. But I'm not a technologist. I'm not, when it comes to talking about water, I'm not a scientist. But I'm a teacher. So I can fuse content and create situations for my students where they can learn about these subjects and create a global context for understanding it. Identifying the online content, including teaching and learning resources that we were generating, and then how to integrate them. And what's in the toolkit? Well, background on the project, the 7 Revolutions content, the case studies. Each of the schools wrote up how we did this, because it worked very differently at different universities. And then we included the materials and the resources, which Denny's going to talk about. And you can access the toolkit online through the PowerPoint.
Yeah, so this is what it looks like in hard copy. And again, as Bill said, the entire toolkit is available free for download by linking from the PowerPoint that's available online. What I'll do then is to talk a little bit about what is in the toolkit. Among the teaching and learning materials, there's sample syllabi that are from some of the ASCU campuses around the country. There's information about global perspectives, and these are some perspectives I've used and then refined over the years, teaching students about problem solving, about futures, about systems perspectives. And with each of those perspectives, there's a set of concepts that are useful, and then there's questions that guide people in using that perspective effectively. I also use a Global Village activity that I'll share with you a little bit later. I have a variety of different handouts that our colleagues have developed. We have some sample exams that are available and that can be adapted, and then some assessment tools as well. In terms of resources, there's a variety of them, some of which we'll demonstrate a little bit later in the context of the classes that we share with you. But many of you are aware of TED Talks, 6 to 18-minute presentations by some of the most knowledgeable people, and a lot of them focus on 7 Revolutions topics. World Mapper, this is a graphic of key issues related to 7 Revolutions. Gapminder is again a depiction of global statistics over time, and I'll just show you that briefly later on. YouTube obviously has a variety of different videos that are available currently related to 7 Revolutions topics. And then SlideShare, one of my colleagues in Fresno uses PowerPoints a great deal. He's not only developed some of his own that he shares through this mechanism, but also led me to look at other PowerPoints, again, that are free and available for download and then can be easily adapted. There's also a variety of videos for 7 Revolutions topics. We are coming out with a second edition of the toolkit. It's in process. It was in a graph. This is what we used in October when we did a presentation. Just wanted to briefly leave the PowerPoint here as well and come down and show you a couple of other resources that'll be in that new toolkit, the new version. So it talks about a wiki. Here is American Democracy Project, a link out of ASQ that has a wiki that includes a lot of this information that's already in the toolkit, but in a little different format. It shows the locations of the participants and so forth. And then if you continue coming down to some teaching materials, there's a global village, and then also TED Talks, syllabi, assignments, so forth, online resources. So one of the things we've developed, you got to have a Facebook account, so you can come here and go to the 7 Revolutions Creating Globally Competent Citizens Facebook group, and there's up-to-date information then that different people around the country have developed. Then I'm going to try to come back here quickly to the wiki, and we also have something called DIGO. DIGO is a way to have different information. This one's going to a place I don't want to be at too long, so I won't spend much time there. But basically the idea is that you can go and if you go to DIGO, D-I-I-G-O, and search 7 Revolutions, there will be a group there. We have put in a variety of different information that is tagged by population, resources, and so forth, so you can get audio, video, print content related to the 7 Revolutions. Let me come back here then to the PowerPoint presentation and back into the presentation mode. We've also then, in addition to the toolkit, said, you know, we ought to help people learn a little bit more specifically about some of the content in the toolkit. So we've done a number of them. One thing we do at the American Democracy Project National Meeting that occurs in June of every year is to present 5 times, both in workshops, 3 or 4 of them, but also in a pre-conference institute that's better part of a day long. We've presented at the University of Minnesota Duluth a few times, Fort Lewis College in Colorado, and then invited some other campuses to come and join us there. University of Minnesota Internationalizing Conference 2 years ago, I made a presentation here that covered some of the same material. We've done one-day workshops in Washington, D.C. and Cal State Fresno, and then multiple sessions at the other campuses that are members of this project. Then going to go on and talk about another activity as well that we're doing, and that is now that we have a toolkit, now that we're sharing some of the information, we find that there are people around the globe, literally, who would like to have access to some of the things that we've been doing. So we're going to share a couple of those with you today. I'm going to talk about a course that's labeled Global Challenges, Promise and Peril in the 21st Century. And one of the things that this emphasizes is we are no longer a 7 Revolutions project. We are now a global engagement project. And the reason for that is that the Center for Strategic and International Studies decided that they didn't want to continue in this particular project on an active basis, but they said, hey, continue to use the 7 Revolutions framework, continue to use all the resources that we have, but we can't devote the resources at this point to the academic project itself. So we went from being a 7 Revolutions project to a global engagement project. We went from a 7 Revolutions course to a Global Challenges course. Bill and I used to be 7 Revolutions scholars. Now we're global engagement scholars. Okay, so it's terminology is different, but certainly the activities are very similar. The first thing that I'm going to talk about in that new context then is the Global Challenges, Promise and Peril in the 21st Century course. This is what we term a national blended learning course. And what we've done is to integrate printed content, audio and video resources, teaching and learning activities, online forums, blogs, wiki assistance, small work groups into a comprehensive course on 7 Revolutions topics. And it's offered, again, in the Epsilon learning environment. So let me go on here. This is going to give you indication that this course is available. We're selling it basically for $50 per student, and students can log on directly. This shows the brochure that we developed, and here's what it looks like in hard copy. If any of you are interested in possibly adopting it later, you're certainly welcome to one of the brochures. But what I'd like to do is to, first of all, I'll get out of PowerPoint again, and you can see that there's a link and it talks about the course. But what I want to do is to come back and, let's see, that's in Firefox, so I need to go back into Safari and show you a little bit about that course. See, first of all, if I'm still logged in, looks like that might be the case. So this is the Model E course that we've developed. And first of all, you'll see some information about the Epsilon learning environment and what is available through that environment. So you see along the side here that there's a place for a syllabus, the lessons, which I'll spend most of the time talking about. There's also a calendar if you want to put that in. You can link to a variety of resources. There's drop boxes where students can put their assignments, which is very helpful in terms of organizing them. You can make announcements, so on a weekly basis I usually talk about, hey, this is what we're going to do this week. There's course mail, so internally you can be able to communicate with any of the students. There's information about the course members in case you want to, and actually you have profiles available so that you can ask students to do mini profiles of themselves so they get a chance to know each other online. There's work groups. So when I teach a course of 50, what I wind up doing is creating work groups, maybe about 8 of them with 6 in a group, and then they interact more actively within those groups. Students can take notes if they want to. There are online forums. There's also an opportunity for synchronous chat. There's actually, this is not enabled here, but there's live classroom as well so that you can use Wimba technology to be in different sites and to be able to interact across the country or the world if you would like. There's blogs. I'll show you a sample blog a little bit later on. Wikis. There's a grade book. Tests. We're using online tests currently, so it's really helpful that I can have my colleagues from across the country develop tests in the different areas where they're more knowledgeable, and then the students take the test. It's scored automatically. Grading tests is not something that I've found that I'd like to do that much. So here actually is live classroom, so if we'd want to use that. There are instructor reports here, a variety of different things that are available, some of which I'll show you in a minute. The core, though, of what I want to show you is 2 things. One is the syllabus. So this is an overview then in the syllabus for the course, and I actually wind up linking to a syllabus that I use as well and really supplant this. So there's what there is adaptability in the course as well. You don't have to adopt it wholesale, but what you do is to adopt the course, and then like a PowerPoint presentation, you just change it to suit your own needs. And it's relatively easy to do that, and there's online instruction on how to go about doing it. So there is goals and objectives of for the syllabus and the course participation and so forth, all the things you'd typically want to find in the syllabus. And you can use this then as just a turnkey operation. You sign up for it, you're the instructor, and you just follow everything that is provided in the course. I tend to adapt it. Like most college faculty, I think I have a better way to do things than what is available out of the box, so I wind up adapting it. What I wanted to do, though, is show the different lessons that are available here. There's a welcome to the course, which is important because it provides information to the students on how to use Epsilon. We then have an introduction saying, hey, here's some important things that you ought to know about this particular course and the content and so forth. It gives the objectives and a variety of perspectives. I'll show you some of that. And then we go through the 7 revolutions. So lesson 2 is population. Lesson 3 is resource management. And I'll, again, demonstrate some of those in a minute. Then after we go through the 7 revolutions, we come back to a topic called global citizenship. And basically it says, okay, now you're probably more knowledgeable about these topics than 95% of the students in the United States. What can you do about it? Okay, so again, you think about these global forces and say, how can I have an impact on shaping them in some small but significant way? So we have an activity called Taking Action, where students are required to put in 5 or 10 hours, either individually or as a group, toward addressing one of the global issues related to 7 revolutions. So what I'd like to do then is to show you how things are organized, again, briefly. Bill, we're doing really well on time. I'm amazed. Yeah. So I'm setting you up, though. I'm going to go a little bit longer than I might have otherwise. Okay, so in the introduction, there's an overview. Again, the objectives for the particular lesson, the learning activities. So students right off the bat know this is what I need to do in this particular course, and these are the objectives that we hope that you achieve. Then move on and have an overview of the course. Again, the broad objectives of the course. These are adapted from the competencies that we showed you on the PowerPoint slides earlier. So looking at the knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Going to the next section here, this provides an example of some of the resources from the Times and from CSIS. So the template on your right here was created by the New York Times. And they happened to populate this template with one introduction. This is from Eric Peterson, who talked about 7 revolutions to 80,000 people in 24 countries and 48 states over about an 8-year period. And he talks about it here for us. So it's nice of him to do that. We also then have a link to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. There's a workbook, 21 pages, 3 pages per revolution, that comes from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So it's an introduction to 7 revolutions. Move on to the next lesson here. This is a global village activity. And what I wind up doing here is to say to students, what if we created a global village in the context of this classroom? What would it look like? Have a little introductory video, and I'm going to show just a little bit of this so you have a sense of what it looks like. So here's the video. It's from 2010, so it's a little out of date now, but still pretty close, called The Miniature Earth. And it starts out without sound. Okay, so what it does then is to go across and say if this was a global village of 100 people, you see that where they're located, but also what is their how many live below the extreme poverty line, making $1 a day or less? How many people have a refrigerator and a roof over their heads? And it concludes by you might be in a different position than this, but be thankful, and also then think about what you can do for the other billions of people around the world. So that's one thing that happens there. The other thing I want to do is to briefly show you how people are assigned to be in the global village. So what I have is a spreadsheet here, and what it does is to give some basic information, the country from which people are in which they're living, their sex, age, whether they're rural or urban, and then an adaptation that my colleague did, and that is to take a look at latitude and longitude. So they can go on the globe and put a pin in the map that we bring in to say where is everybody located. So we assign people, first of all, to be in those settings. Then let me come back here, and we got a lot of stuff here now. Come back to the lesson. Initially what I do then is in the introduction to ask people to go out and find information about the person they represent in the global village. So here's some of the information. And then also I ask them to actually give them some resources. So here's a wiki that I developed and that students sometimes add to, saying, hey, here's some resources to find out that information. I then give them a sample blog. I need to come back down a little bit, so that they can say, okay, here's what it looks like. So here's one that I've developed for Esmeralda, who lives in El Salvador. It's a 12-year-old girl. So they get a sense of what we're looking at. And then we ask them, as we go through and look at population, we say, okay, what is the population revolution? How does that impact the country you represent in the global village and the individual? And you find most, 1 out of 6 people live in China. And certainly they're very influenced by population, one-child policy, variety of other things. In terms of technology, if you're on the east coast of China, you're very much impacted by that. But if you live in the rural areas, not so much. So it's helpful to see that there's differences within countries. So that's the global village. What am I doing here, Bill? Bill's watching time for me because he knows that he's going last, and if he doesn't keep me on schedule, then I'll leave a little time for you. So let me go briefly just to population, one of the 7 revolutions. So again, there's objectives and learning activities that start out. Also included there are some rubrics for the global village activities, so students know what is expected of them and they can get feedback on it. There's an overview about population, and again you see some templates here, but these are some that we created, not the New York Times created, but the global engagement scholars did. I happened to do this particular lesson, and other people did other lessons. So this is population overview, the United Nations population fact sheet. You can go to the World Population Clock, and it'll tell you that there's slightly over 7 billion people in the world today. And then one of the things I do is I show them the clock at the beginning of the time that I start talking about population, and at the end, and they find out that there's 2 million more people in the world in the 3 days that we spend talking about population. It's quite dramatic in its representation there. I'm going to go on to some other things here. Here's growth in developing countries. So you see now there's a rich set of materials along the right-hand side. That's a template that I created that relates to population resources from the New York Times, including a Times topic on population. Here's Hans Rosling. He's going to have a TED Talk here where he'll talk about not only giving some graphic, in terms of boxes, information about population and development, but also will introduce Gapminder, which is an interactive resource that can be used. Go a little bit further here and emphasize that not only is there growth in developing countries, but there's also aging in developed countries. Again, some Times resources. Here's Richard Jackson. He was interviewed from CSIS about aging. He's been studying it for about 10 years. And I would much rather have Richard Jackson talk about this topic for 10 minutes than for me to try to scramble and put something together. So I'm glad Richard is available and that CSIS made him so. Show one more thing here, Bill, and then we'll turn it over to you. So I'm going to go then to migration across borders, which along with urbanization are other key issues, and show some of the kinds of things that the Times has made available. So here's a snapshot of global migration. And the Times then have some interactive graphics. So this shows the net flow of immigrants from 2000 to 2005. So I acknowledge that it's a little bit late, that it's a little bit outdated and we could update this. But when you take a look at the average numbers of people that migrated during that time, on average about 1.3 million people came into the United States. Correspondingly, approximately 800,000 left Mexico. So it graphically depicts that. You take a look, though, however, at Spain. They had about half as many people coming into a country that has far less population than we do. So we think we're a nation of immigrants. Well, Spain has significant numbers as well. Then there's other things you can take a look at. One of the things that I like to look at is the amount of money sent home by people who are living in other countries. So if you take a look at that, you take a look at Moldova, and 28% of their gross domestic product is money that's sent back to their country from people from Moldova who are living in other areas. I had a chance to go to El Salvador a little bit ago, a couple years ago, and here 18% of the gross domestic product of El Salvador comes back into their country, mostly from the United States. Huge importance there. One of the things I was amazed at was that in El Salvador, when we looked at technology, there's 7 million cell phones and 6 million people. I said, what's going on? And the reason there's so many cell phones is they want to keep in contact with their family members who are in the United States so they don't forget to send some of that money back to them. So it's a great investment. So you see the connection between some of the population issues and the technology issues. And with that, Bill, I'll get back to the PowerPoint presentation and take it away.
Okay. When the New York Times heard about what I was doing with my Introduction to Theater Arts class, they said, hey, make a class for the Knowledge Network that's like that. And I began to develop the course. It's called Theater and Global Change. And we offered it for the first time last year in 2 parts. It was synchronous. We had live web sessions with guests where we could all go into a WIMBA classroom once a week or so, and the students could ask experts about the global trends. But I also was able to include a live interview with Ben Brantley, the chief critic of the New York Times, and they were able to ask the critic questions. After last year's experiment, this is a co-branded class, so it's the New York Times Knowledge Network and UMD, and they have an agreement to split whatever comes in the door, so it does benefit UMD. And they asked me to put it into an asynchronous, self-paced online course. And so I modified it again, and it just opened up last Saturday. The plays that I included this time are Antigone, Fences, Othello, RUR, The Skin of Our Teeth. And I'm going to... Is that going to get me to the right place? Let's see.
Hopefully you're still logged in on the other tab there.
So this is Theater and Global Change. And basically I've developed all the content. I work with a designer in New York who makes it look pretty. That's why there's that wonderful little graphic there. And I just want to quickly, because Denny has kind of showed you the how Epsilon works. I just want to give you an example of one of the lessons, and I'm going to pick Theater as Futurism. There was a play written in 1921 by Carol Capek called RUR. It's the first use of the word robot, and it's about it's the future. In 1921, which looks surprisingly like the 1960s, and there are these robots, and they eventually all the live people are dead, and the robots can't recreate themselves, and it's a pretty good play. It's not a great play. I used some great plays in this class, like Antigone and Othello and Fences and The Skin of Our Teeth. But I also wanted to give a connection to talk about 2 things. And so it starts off with learning objectives, and then moves to this idea of theater as futurism. And there's this wonderful interview with a robot on the Times repository. It's fascinating that this psychologist interviews this robot, and it is showing that it's an incomplete technology, but some of it's really scary. Okay, and then I made my own video introductions to each of the revolutions and each of the plays, so I can talk a little bit about the theater context and a little bit about the global trend context. This gives you an idea of the repository and some of the wonderful things that you can put together. These are Times Topics pages, so you can find hundreds of articles about robots chronologically. So the most recent ones are at the front about AI. There's interactive features, and then some feature articles about different topics in there. And then also, I can go back and find the original reviews to the 1921 production of RUR that appeared in New York, and other articles about Carol Capek. So I can inform the student about both the theater part of it and the global change part of it through the Times content. This also includes, and then this is my RUR introduction. But then there's Kevin Kelly talking about how technology evolves, and one of the other topics that I'm going to cover in here has to do with the singularity. I also wanted to talk about performing tomorrow today, because this is something that's been somewhat common in theater art, is that we look forward. The artist writes a story about what might be, and it's hard to get the future right. One of the big differences, and one of the things that makes, I think, this project relevant, is that because of all that information we have at our fingertips, and because of what the computer and other technologies are allowing us to do, we can process a lot more data quicker, and we can look forward and see trends happening. We're still going to get things wrong, but if we can harness what technology is allowing us to do, we might be able to have a clearer vision of trends and get out in front of them. It's a complicated conversation, though. There's a picture from RUR. And then these are just examples of different ways that theater presently, and I built all of these templates just before the opening of the course, and so when I label it 2012, it means I'm able to search today, last week, last month, last year, everything since 1851. And so I try to do up-to-date templates that are just in the last year, and keep updating them every time I get a chance to revise the course. Other topics in this lesson include the singularity. Maybe you've heard Ray Kurzweil talk about the singularity, that moment when computer technology will be able to process information faster than our brains. And also the idea of biotechnology, the fusion of our bodies with technology. We're doing it with hearing aids. They're now working on a digital eye. You can control your computer without your hands by putting this device on your head, and you can think your computer to do things. As we fuse with technology, what it means to be human is changing. I'm going to depart from here and conclude. Let's see how I get back to where I was. Oh, I know how to do it. Right there. What this project has indicated are these emerging partnerships. This idea of an association of state colleges and universities partnering with a corporation, the New York Times, and with a nonprofit bipartisan think tank to create new curriculum. Collaborative curriculum development, scholars from across the country creating the global engagement class, and using different specializations to create one class that can encompass the interdisciplinary nature of this material. And then trying to use new pedagogical models. My next step with the Theater and Global Change class is to adapt it into a hybrid model for my campus. The content is there. I just need to add the classroom sessions and make those active learning activities so that the online content is where you read and learn and do what you do best on your own, come together 4 or 5 times a semester and actually create something. So, from faculty members and institutions going it alone to partnerships. From curriculum development as a cottage industry where 1,000 faculty members develop a global issues course all over the country, all in their own way, to a global course that faculty members can make changes to, a national project. To that Sage on the Stage model, to organizing multiple teaching and learning activities to achieve identified goals. We have a minute. Do you have any questions for us? The concern about a narrow perspective, a US-centered perspective, and about collaborating with a single newspaper and media organization. Is that? We try to include a variety of different perspectives through the additional online resources. And the Times has begun to put into their repository the ability to access other other repositories that, like NPR and other locations where you can get news. I know we connect our students with these sources as well, which span the globe. Is it a U.S.-centric perspective? Perhaps.
Yeah, it is. To a large extent, it's a U.S.-centric perspective. What we try to do is to balance that with, for example, inviting students to participate in the global village, and really to the best of their ability to try to look at the world from a different perspective. And many students are able to do that quite well. We try to lead them through that in the context of the course. So when the issue of population comes up, the student who represents Indonesia will come and say, well, in Jakarta, this is the experience that my 6-year-old would have. So we try to use the students as people who can try to broaden the perspective and to bring in videos from Mumbai, walking through the streets of Mumbai in one of the slums that exists there. So try to do that in a variety of different ways. But we have, in the words of George Mahaffey, who quotes Darrell Royal, dance with those who brung you. The Times has been a very big supporter of this project, and they have a rich repository, so we use it when we can. We also try to balance it with different perspectives.
Most of the plays that I use are not from U.S. plays, and so, or it's a balance. And when you teach a play, you have to put it in its context, its cultural context. So now you have the perspective of the author who isn't an American. And usually I have some contemporary work in there, but most of it's from other historical periods. So you tend to have to frame it in terms of what was happening around the author at that time.
But those are very important concerns. And part of what we've been doing is the course has evolved over a period of time. And one of the things we're trying to integrate into it is more intercultural kinds of activities. Yeah. So if you have more questions, feel free to continue asking them. If you want to come forward, we can respond to them there as well. But thank you very much for participating. Appreciate you being here.